Josiah stands in a valley just outside the walls of Jerusalem, and he is destroying it on purpose. It's 622 BC. The king has already torn down the altars in the temple. Now his men are here, in the ravine south of the city, breaking apart stone platforms, hauling in bones from a nearby burial ground, and scattering them across the ground to make the place unusable, permanently defiled, in the eyes of his people, for anything sacred ever again. This valley has a name, the Valley of Ben-Hinnom. For generations, children were brought here and given to a god called Molech, passed through fire while their own families watched. Josiah wants this valley erased from memory. He does not succeed. Roughly 6 centuries later, a rabbi from Nazareth stands on a hillside not far from here, teaching a crowd about anger, about lust, about the state of the human heart, and he reaches for one word to describe the danger of it. He doesn't invent a new term. He points, in effect, at this exact ground. Why would Jesus choose the name of this valley, of all places, to describe the thing your English Bible simply calls hell? To understand why, we have to go back before Josiah, back to the kings who made that valley what it was, and further back still, to the kingdom they were trying to protect. Long before any of this happened, the valley already had a place on the map. In the book of Joshua, centuries earlier, the Valley of Ben-Hinnom is simply a boundary line, the marker separating the territory of Judah from the territory of Benjamin, mentioned matter-of-factly the way a modern map might mention a river or a ridge. There's nothing ominous about it yet, it's just geography. That's worth holding on to, because it means the valley's later reputation wasn't inherited from its landscape. It was built, deliberately, by what human beings chose to do inside it. By the 8th century BC, Judah is a small kingdom caught between larger ones. To the north and east, the Assyrian Empire is expanding, a military machine that has already swallowed the northern kingdom of Israel and deported much of its population, an event Judah's kings watch happen to their own cousins with understandable dread. Survival, for a kingdom this size, often means choosing which larger power to appease. Ahaz chooses appeasement early. According to the biblical record, in his desperation to secure Assyrian protection, he doesn't just borrow their politics, he borrows their gods, going so far as to commission a new altar for the Jerusalem temple modeled on one he saw in Damascus, while paying homage to the Assyrian king. The valley itself sits just south and west of Jerusalem's walls, a natural ravine cutting along the base of the city, deep enough that from the ridge above you'd lose sight of anyone standing in it. In a kingdom under this kind of pressure, that made it useful for something Judah's kings wanted hidden from the temple courts just up the hill. King Ahaz rules first. Then, later, his grandson Manasseh, whose reign lasts longer than almost any king in Judah's history, over half a century on the throne, according to the biblical record. Much of it lived under the long shadow of Assyrian dominance. Both men, according to the text, do something no king of Judah is supposed to do. They bring their own children down into that ravine, to a site called Topheth, and give them to a god named Molech. Some scholars have connected the word Topheth to a Hebrew root associated with a drum, the theory being that drums were beaten during these rites, possibly to muffle the cries of the children being offered. That connection is not certain. The exact etymology of Topheth is debated among linguists, and it's worth naming as one proposed explanation rather than an established fact. But whether or not the drum theory holds, what happened there is not in dispute. The text names it plainly more than once in the books of Kings and Chronicles, and it isn't abstract theology, it's family, standing in a specific place, making a specific choice, in front of each other. For a religious culture built entirely around covenant, around the conviction that this God had claimed this people, this land, this family line, going all the way back to the promises made to Abraham, this is the deepest possible betrayal available to them, not idolatry in the abstract. Idolatry paid for with their own children, in a valley they could walk to from the temple gates in under an hour. The prophet Jeremiah, watching Judah's slow collapse a generation later, doesn't let the place keep its old name. He tells the people that a day is coming when no one will call this the Valley of Ben-Hinnom anymore. It will be called something else, the Valley of Slaughter. A prophetic renaming isn't decoration. In the world of the text, changing a place's name is how you fix a verdict onto it permanently, the way a scar keeps the memory of a wound long after the wound itself is healed. That's the valley Josiah tries to erase with bones and broken altars in 622 BC, as part of a much wider reform that also tears down shrines across the countryside and rediscovers a lost scroll of the law in the temple itself. And it's the valley that doesn't go away, not physically and not in memory. Long after the fires at Topheth are cold, long after Assyria itself falls to Babylon, and Babylon in turn falls to Persia, and Persia gives way to the Greek and then Roman worlds, the name of that valley survives. It becomes shorthand. Not a footnote in a history book, but a word ordinary people reach for when they need to name the worst thing they can imagine. By the centuries, just before Jesus' birth, a period scholars often call the Second Temple period, Jewish writers outside the Bible itself are already using the valley's name this way in their own religious literature, as a term connected to divine judgment. That's a detail worth being careful with. It tells us the word had already taken on this weight in Jewish thought before Jesus ever used it, but it comes from writings outside Scripture and shouldn't be treated with the same authority as the biblical text itself. It's context, not Scripture, background that helps explain why Jesus' audience didn't need the term defined for them, not an additional source of revelation. Which brings us forward, past exile, past return, past the rise of Rome, to a hillside in Galilee, roughly 600 years after Josiah's men finished their work. A crowd has gathered to hear a rabbi teach. He is not talking about ancient history. He's talking about anger, about what happens in a person's heart before it ever reaches their hands. And when he reaches for a word serious enough to carry that warning, he doesn't invent one. He says, Gehenna. Notice where he says it. This isn't a sermon about the end of the world. Matthew places this teaching early, right after Jesus tells the crowd that their righteousness has to run deeper than the religious experts around them, right in the middle of a section about anger. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to the Gehenna of fire. Look at what's happening. Jesus isn't building toward a description of the afterlife. He's building a case about the human heart, about the gap between what the law forbids on the outside and what's actually happening on the inside. And at the exact moment he needs a word serious enough to carry that warning, he doesn't reach for a general term for the grave or a vague phrase for judgment. He reaches for the name of a valley. Think about what that would sound like to the people standing there. It isn't like saying, you'll go to a bad place. It's closer to naming an actual location everyone in the room already has feelings about, the way naming a real battlefield does something a made-up metaphor never could. Not a symbol invented for the moment, a name already carrying 6 centuries of weight. That raises an obvious question, though. If this word already meant something specific to Jesus' audience, where did that meaning come from, and is what most of us have been told about it even accurate? Here's where a lot of us have to unlearn something. If you've sat through more than a handful of sermons on this passage, you've probably heard the explanation. Gehenna was Jerusalem's trash dump, fires burning around the clock. Smoke always rising, a place so foul, so associated with garbage and decay, that Jesus' listeners could practically smell it while he spoke. It's a vivid image. It shows up in study Bible footnotes, in commentaries, in sermon after sermon. One researcher who went looking, checking over a dozen study Bibles and most major commentaries on this passage, found the garbage dump description repeated in nearly all of them. It's also not something anyone can actually document from Jesus' own time. The earliest known source for the burning garbage dump description isn't a first-century writer at all. It's a rabbi named David Kimhi, writing a commentary on the Psalms around the year 1200. That's not a small gap. That's over 1,000 years after Jesus stood on that hillside. And when scholars have gone looking for earlier evidence, literary sources, archaeological remains, anything from the centuries between the valley's defilement and Jesus' ministry, there's simply nothing there to support a perpetually burning dump existing in his lifetime. Even Kimhi's own description, read carefully, is mostly about disposing of bodies and refuse by fire rather than describing ongoing torment. Later readers and preachers seem to have stretched his comment further than he appears to have intended it. It's worth being fair to the people who've taught it this way. It's a genuinely plausible-sounding explanation, and once it gets repeated in enough commentaries, it starts to feel like settled history rather than an educated guess passed down from a medieval commentator. But plausible isn't the same as documented, and in this particular case, the documentation simply isn't there. Not a smoldering trash heap Jesus' audience could smell that day, a valley whose horror predated any fire of refuse by centuries, a place remembered first and foremost for what was done to children there, not for what may or may not have been thrown away there over 1,000 years later. So if the garbage dump wasn't what gave this word its weight, we're left with a real question. What did that valley's name actually carry into the ears of the people listening to Jesus that day? The answer isn't hidden. Jesus tells us himself, just a few verses later, in a different gospel, and he does it by quoting someone far older than Kimhi, older than the rabbis, older even than the Roman occupation of Judea. In Mark's gospel, warning his listeners about the same valley, Jesus says something startling, "Where their worm does not die, and the fire is not quenched." That line isn't original to Jesus. It's the last verse of the book of Isaiah, a prophecy written centuries earlier, describing worshippers walking out from a restored Jerusalem to look at the bodies of those who rebelled against God, lying exposed outside the city, undisturbed by decay, unconsumed by fire. Watch what Jesus is doing. He isn't decorating his warning with a scary new image pulled from contemporary Jerusalem life. He's picking up a sentence Israel already knew from its own scriptures, a sentence about judgment, about rebellion, about corpses left outside the walls of the holy city. And he's attaching it to the name of the one valley in Israel's history that had actually seen that kind of horror in real life. Not a new metaphor, an old prophecy given a specific address. This is the moment the picture starts to come into focus. The power in Jesus' word wasn't manufactured by smoke and trash fires centuries after the fact. It was inherited from Isaiah's warning, from Jeremiah's renaming, from the valley itself. Jesus didn't need to invent the horror. Israel's own history and Israel's own prophets had already written it for him. There's a pattern worth noticing in how often Jesus returns to this word, because it isn't a single passing comment. In Matthew's Gospel, he warns that it's better to lose an eye or a hand than for the whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. In another passage, he tells his followers not to fear those who can kill the body, but to fear the one who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. Luke records a nearly identical version of that same warning, though Luke's Gospel, notably, doesn't use the word Gehenna at all in that verse. It simply says, "the one who has authority to cast into hell." That small difference between two Gospels reporting the same teaching is a reminder that these Greek terms don't always translate into English, or even move between one Gospel writer and another with perfect one-to-one precision. The underlying warning is consistent. The specific vocabulary carrying it shifts slightly depending on the writer. There's a smaller detail worth pausing on here too, because it changes how we should read some of these warnings. Gehenna shows up 12 times across the entire New Testament, and 11 of those come directly from Jesus' own mouth in the Gospels. It's overwhelmingly his word, not a general term the early church reached for on its own. The single exception is the book of James, and there it isn't describing the afterlife at all. James uses it to describe the destructive power of an unchecked tongue, set on fire by Gehenna. That's a strange thing to notice, but it tells us something important. Even within the New Testament, this image could be applied to present corruption, not only to future judgment. The word Jesus reaches for isn't a fixed technical label for the afterlife, the way a modern theological dictionary might use it. It's a loaded historical image, and different writers, in different contexts, aim that image at different targets. There's an older word worth knowing too, sitting quietly behind all of this. Long before Gehenna ever appears in the Gospels, the Old Testament uses a Hebrew term, Sheol, for the realm of the dead in general. Sheol doesn't clearly mean a place of punishment throughout the Old Testament. In many passages, it simply means the grave, or the shadowy fate awaiting everyone, righteous and wicked alike. Job speaks of Sheol as the common destination of all the living. The psalmists speak of it the same way, sometimes with dread, sometimes almost matter-of-factly, as the place bodies go. That ambiguity is part of why it's translated inconsistently even within the King James Version, sometimes as hell, sometimes as grave, sometimes as pit, occasionally within the very same book. That inconsistency isn't a flaw unique to one translation. It's a sign of translators wrestling honestly with a term that doesn't map cleanly onto the English word hell at all. If this is helping you see this passage the way its first listeners would have heard it, that's exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to slow down and notice. If it's connecting dots for you, it helps more people find their way here, so consider subscribing to the Scripture Project before we go further. Because Gehenna is only half the story your English Bible is hiding. There's another word, one Jesus' own followers reached for after he was gone, one borrowed from a completely different world than Jeremiah's valley, a word with a God's name attached to it, and a very different picture of where the dead actually go. Step outside the Gospels for a moment, into a parable Jesus tells in Luke. A rich man dies, so does a poor man named Lazarus, who spent his life at the rich man's gate. And Luke tells us the rich man ends up in Hades, being in torment. Hades, not Gehenna, a different word entirely. It's worth pausing on the fact that this scene comes to us as a parable, a teaching story, not a first-hand report of the afterlife's architecture. That matters for how much weight we should put on its specific details, like the visible conversation across the chasm separating the two men. The core moral point of the story, that how we treat the poor in this life carries real weight beyond it, is clear. Exactly how literally to press every detail of its setting is something careful, faithful readers of Scripture have long debated, and this video isn't the place to resolve that particular question. Where does that word even come from? Not from Jeremiah, not from the Valley of Ben-Hinnom. Hades is a name borrowed straight out of Greek mythology, the god of the underworld, and the underworld itself. Centuries before Jesus was born, when Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, a translation project known as the Septuagint, produced roughly in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC for Greek-speaking Jewish communities scattered across the Mediterranean world, they needed a Greek word for that old Hebrew term, Sheol, the shadowy general realm of the dead. They reached for Hades. It stuck. By the time Jesus is teaching, several generations later, Hades is simply the standard Greek word educated Jewish readers would expect for the place the dead go, righteous and unrighteous alike, in most usage, not a term specifically reserved for final punishment. So already, something is emerging that most readers never notice. Gehenna and Hades aren't two names for the same thing. They're two different pictures, from two different worlds of origin, doing two different jobs in the text. One rooted in a specific valley and Israel's own prophetic history. The other, inherited from a translation choice made centuries earlier to render a general Hebrew term for death. Hades shows up elsewhere in the New Testament too, and each appearance adds another layer. Jesus tells the town of Capernaum that its arrogance will bring it down to Hades. In Acts, Peter quotes a psalm about God's promise that his soul would not be abandoned to Hades, applying the line to Jesus' resurrection. In each case, Hades functions the way Sheol functioned in the Old Testament, as a term for death's domain in general, not as a specific description of ongoing torment reserved for the wicked. Luke's parable of the rich man is actually the one clear exception, the one passage that explicitly describes torment happening within Hades. That's part of why so much careful, honest scholarship treats that passage cautiously. It's doing something slightly different with the word than most of its other New Testament appearances. There's a third word, even rarer, worth knowing about here too. In his second letter, Peter warns about false teachers by pointing back to the judgment of rebellious angels, and he uses a verb found nowhere else in the entire Bible. God cast them into Tartarus. That's not a Hebrew word at all. It's lifted directly from Greek mythology again, the name of the deep abyss beneath Hades, where, in the old stories, the Greek gods imprisoned the Titans after defeating them. Peter uses this term exactly once in the entire New Testament and applies it only to fallen spiritual beings, never to human judgment. 3 separate words then, 3 separate sources, one rooted in Israel's own land and history, 2 borrowed from the surrounding Greek-speaking world, 1 English translation flattening all 3 into a single word, hell. Here's where it gets harder to ignore. Turn to the book of Revelation, near the very end, at the final judgment. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Read that again, slowly. Hades isn't described here as the final destination. It's described as a holding place, something that gives up what it's been keeping, gets judged itself, and then is thrown into something else entirely. The lake of fire is presented as a separate, final reality that Hades is thrown into, not a reality Hades simply is. This is the same book that later describes that lake of fire as the fate of death itself, of Hades itself, and of those whose names were not found written in the book of life, a picture that stands somewhat apart, in its own vocabulary, from either Gehenna or Hades individually. Sit with that for a second, because most of us have never been taught to separate these ideas. We grew up hearing hell used as one seamless word covering everything, the place the rich man goes in Luke's parable, the place Jesus warns about on the hillside, the final judgment scene in Revelation. One word, one place, one picture in the popular imagination. The text itself doesn't treat it that way. Hades, in the pattern Revelation gives us, functions like a waiting room that eventually gets emptied out and demolished, not like the final courtroom itself. Gehenna, meanwhile, is never described anywhere in Scripture as being thrown into anything else. It already carries, from Jeremiah and Isaiah, the weight of a final verdict, a place of judgment rooted in Israel's own history, rather than a general holding state for the dead awaiting one. It's worth mentioning, briefly and carefully, that later Jewish tradition kept developing this picture long after the New Testament was written. Rabbinic writings, compiled centuries after Jesus, well into the 2nd, 3rd, and later centuries AD, describe Gehenna in increasingly elaborate detail, at one point picturing it with multiple gates in different locations. That material is genuinely interesting for understanding how the concept continued to grow within later Judaism, but it comes from long after the New Testament period and shouldn't be read back into Jesus' own teaching as though he had that later, fuller picture already in mind. It's a separate stream of tradition, downstream of the Gospels, not a source for them. This is worth being careful with. Serious, faithful readers of Scripture land in different places on exactly how these details fit together theologically, and on what they mean for questions about the nature and duration of final judgment. That's a real and long-standing conversation among people who take the text seriously, across many centuries and traditions, and it deserves more honesty than a single video can offer. This isn't the place to settle it, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But here's what the text itself will support, plainly, without needing to resolve that larger debate. English collapsed at least 2, arguably 3, distinct biblical pictures into one 4-letter word. And Jesus, when he stood on that hillside, warning people about anger and the state of their hearts, didn't reach for the general term. He didn't say Hades, he said Gehenna. He pointed at a valley, not a myth borrowed from another culture, a specific, remembered, walkable piece of ground outside the walls of his own city, ground that had already told Israel exactly what judgment looked like, long before he ever opened his mouth to speak of it. That valley still exists today, on the south side of Jerusalem's old city, now a green, quiet park, walked through by tourists who mostly have no idea what the ground beneath them once held. So picture it again, all at once. A valley south of Jerusalem, once just a boundary line on a map before it became something else entirely. Fires that once took children. A father named Ahaz, buying safety from an empire with something no empire should have been offered. A father named Manasseh, ruling longer than almost any king Judah ever had, and ruling badly for much of it. A prophet named Jeremiah, standing over the ruin of what they'd done, refusing to let the place keep its old, softer name. A king named Josiah, generations later, breaking altars, scattering bones, trying to bury the memory so deep it could never rise to the surface again. It rose anyway. 600 years pass, empires come, empires fall. Assyria gives way to Babylon, Babylon gives way to Persia, Persia gives way to Greece, and then to Rome. The valley outside the walls doesn't move. It just waits, carrying its name forward through all of it, through exile, through return, through centuries where no one sacrifices anything there at all, and the name still means exactly what it always meant. Then a rabbi stands on a hillside, not far away, close enough that some in the crowd could have pointed toward it without turning far. He's not talking about geography. He's talking about anger, about what a human heart does when left unchecked. And when he reaches for the one word heavy enough to carry that warning, he doesn't invent something new. He says Gehenna, not Hades, the old Greek word for the shadowy realm every dead person enters, a holding place Revelation itself says will one day be emptied out and undone. Not Tartarus, a term borrowed once and only for fallen angels. Not an abstraction floating somewhere beyond the sky, detached from any particular history. A valley, an address, a history his listeners already carried in their bones without needing it explained to them. That's the thing your English Bible quietly smooths over every time it prints the word hell. One word, standing in for names that used to mean something specific, names Jesus and his followers each chose on purpose, the way you or I would choose a real place, a real memory, to make a warning impossible to misunderstand or soften into an abstraction. He didn't ask his listeners to imagine some far-off cosmic courtroom they'd never seen. He pointed at ground they already knew, ground that remembered what happens when people lose sight of God completely, ground that had already told the truth about judgment, long before he ever opened his mouth to say it again. There's something worth sitting with here, and it isn't a lesson. Every one of us carries a version of that valley, not a literal ravine outside a literal city, but a place inside us where something got sacrificed a long time ago, and we've spent years making sure nobody looks there too closely. A choice made under pressure, the way Ahaz made his, under the pressure of an empire he couldn't outrun. A pattern we told ourselves we'd break, and didn't, the way Manasseh's reign just kept going, decade after decade, the wrong direction, until it had defined an entire generation. Most of us have also tried Josiah's approach at some point: bury it, scatter something over the site of it, make the ground unusable for memory so no one, including us, has to look at it again. It doesn't work for us either. It didn't work for him. The reform was real, and it mattered, but the valley's name still outlasted it, the way our own attempts to bury something usually leave the memory of it standing anyway, just under a thinner layer of ground. That's what makes Jesus's choice of that word so hard to sit with honestly. He didn't reach for a vague, distant idea of judgment when he warned people about anger, about lust, about the quiet decay of a heart left unchecked. He reached for the most specific image available to him, a real place that had actually held the worst thing a person can do to another person. And he pointed it, not outward at Rome, not at the religious leaders standing nearby, not at some far-off enemy of Israel, but inward, at the anger sitting in an ordinary person's chest, at what happens in the dark, alone, long before anyone else ever sees it or names it. That's the uncomfortable intimacy of it. Gehenna wasn't a threat aimed at the worst people in the room. It was a mirror held up to everyone in it, including the people who thought they had nothing to hide. which means the valley was never only about them. It was never only about a king 6 centuries gone, or a prophet's warning to a nation that no longer exists in the same form it once did. It's about the plain, unremarkable fact that every human heart is capable of building its own version of that place, quietly, privately, one small unchecked thing at a time, until the ground beneath it needs its own name too. Jesus didn't say that to frighten a crowd standing on a hillside. He said it because he thought their hearts were worth telling the truth to. Jesus never asked anyone to imagine hell. He asked them to remember a valley. If this is the kind of study that helps you read Scripture the way it was meant to be read, closely, honestly, with the world behind the words restored, consider subscribing to The Scripture Project. And if this opens something up for you, send it to someone who's only ever read this word in English. There's more ground like this still waiting to be walked.